Okay, so you want to own an oyster farm. You've seen the pictures. Sunrise over a quiet bay, a guy in waders pulling wire cages out of the water, shaking them once, twice, dropping them back in. No warehouse, no employees screaming at each other in a kitchen, no inventory going bad in a freezer. Just you, salt water, and a product that literally feeds itself. You have driven past those coastal flats on the way to a beach vacation. Maybe you stopped at a raw bar and paid $4 for something that, as far as you could tell, just sat in the ocean for 2 years and grew. No feed costs, no barn, no vet bills. The animal eats plankton from the tide for free. You think, this might be the closest thing to free money that exists in agriculture. Here's the problem. The U.S. farmed oyster market moves north of $400 million a year. It is growing at about 3.5% annually. Demand for premium, single-origin oysters is higher than it has ever been. And yet, most small oyster farms in America struggle to clear a living wage for their owner. So how does an industry with no feed costs, rising demand, and a product that grows itself still manage to barely pay its operators? Because the economics of growing oysters have almost nothing to do with oysters. Now, let's talk about how this business actually works. There are 3 broad ways to farm oysters in the U.S., and the economics are completely different depending on which one you pick. The first is bottom culture. You scatter seed directly on the ocean floor and come back in a couple years to dredge them up. This is the old school method, common in the Gulf and parts of the Chesapeake. Low labor, low gear cost, but you have almost zero control over shape, size, or survival. You are basically gambling that nature cooperates. The second is off-bottom cage culture. This is what most new East Coast farms use. You grow oysters in floating bags or cages suspended in the water column. More labor, more equipment, but you control the product. You can tumble them, the industry term for shaking and flipping the cages so the shells bang together and chip at the edges. That forces the oyster to grow a deeper cup and a harder shell. You are basically training the animal into the shape a raw bar wants. The goal is what growers call a single, a standalone oyster with a clean, deep cup that sits flat on a plate. That is what gets you $3 instead of 60 cents. The third is rack and bag, common on the West Coast and parts of New England. Similar to cage culture, but mounted on fixed racks that sit on the tidal flats. Exposed at low tide, submerged at high tide. Good water flow, good shell shape, but you are physically out there at 5 a.m. on a minus tide in January, hauling bags in water cold enough to make your hands stop working. One more thing that changed the math for all 3 methods. Triploid oysters. A triploid is an oyster bred with 3 sets of chromosomes instead of 2. That makes it sterile. Why does sterility matter? Because a normal oyster spends its summer energy spawning, which makes the meat thin and watery from May through August. A triploid skips spawning entirely. It keeps packing on meat year-round. That means you can sell a premium half-shell product in July when every other farmer's oysters are skinny and milky. Most serious farms in 2026 are running at least 50% triploid stock. The seed costs about 1/3 more per thousand, but the year-round marketability is what makes the economics work. Here is what matters. Bottom culture produces a commodity. You sell it in bulk to shucking houses for around 50 to 70 cents an oyster. Off-bottom and rack culture produce a branded half-shell product. That same biological species, grown 2 miles away in a different method, sells for $3 to $5 at a raw bar. Same animal, completely different business. Let's start with what it costs to get in. A small operation, maybe 1 to 2 acres of leased water, basic floating cages, a used skiff, and your first round of spat, which is what the industry calls baby oyster seed, you are looking at 50 to 150 grand. That gets you in the water. A serious commercial setup, 10+ acres with sorting equipment, a refrigerated truck, and a shore facility, runs $250,000 to $500,000. But the startup cost is not the real barrier. The real barrier is time. An oyster takes 18 to 36 months from seed to market size. That means you are spending money every single month before you sell a single oyster. Your cages need maintenance, your lease fees are due, your boat needs fuel, and your inventory is just sitting in the water, slowly growing, completely exposed to anything the ocean decides to throw at it. Here's the part nobody tells you. Before you even start that clock, you need a water lease. And getting a water lease approved in most coastal states takes 2 to 5 years. Environmental impact reviews, public comment periods, neighbor objections, zoning board hearings. In some states, a single complaint from a waterfront homeowner who does not want to look at your cages can stall your permit for a year. So the real startup timeline is not 18 months to your first harvest. It is 3 to 7 years from the day you decide to do this to the day you deposit your first check. Now, the operating costs. Your biggest variable cost is labor. Oyster farming is physical. You are hauling cages that weigh 60, sometimes 80 pounds out of the water, sorting oysters by hand or with a tumbler, cleaning gear, grading product by size, bagging orders, and running them to your cold storage or directly to a restaurant's back door. On a mid-size farm, labor runs 30 to 40% of your total costs. Your second biggest cost is gear replacement. Saltwater destroys everything. Cages corrode, bags tear, floats crack. Budget north of 10% of your revenue just to keep your equipment from falling apart. Then there is the cost nobody thinks about: mortality. In a normal year, you lose 15 to 30% of your stock. That is just baseline. Predators, rough weather, normal attrition. But if a disease hits, those numbers go vertical. MSX and Dermo, two parasitic diseases common in the Mid-Atlantic and Gulf, can kill 50 to 95% of a susceptible crop. One bad summer and your entire 18-month investment is dead on the bottom. That is what running an oyster farm looks like from the inside. Not the sunrise photo on Instagram, but the Tuesday morning when you pull a cage and half your crop is empty shells. And then there's Vibrio. Not a threat to your oysters, a threat to your customers. Vibrio parahemolyticus is a naturally occurring bacteria that spikes in warm water. If someone gets sick from a raw oyster traced back to your farm, the health department shuts your harvest area down. That closure lasts a week minimum, sometimes 3. In peak summer, when you're moving your highest volume, 3 weeks of zero revenue isn't an inconvenience. It is a quarter of your annual income gone. The regulation behind this is the FDA's National Shellfish Sanitation Program, the NSSP. Every commercial oyster sold in America must come from a certified harvest area that gets tested regularly for bacteria levels. If levels spike, your area gets shut down, and you cannot harvest until it passes again. You don't get a warning. You get a phone call that says, "Stop." And because the testing schedule is set by the state, not by you, there is no way to plan around it. You wake up on a Tuesday, ready to fill a 2,000 oyster restaurant order, and find out your water just got closed. This is the concept that explains everything else. The industry calls it Merroir. It works the same way terroir works in wine. An oyster is a filter feeder. It pumps dozens of gallons of water through its body every day. Whatever is in that water, the salinity, the mineral content, the type of algae, that is what the oyster tastes like. A high salinity bay produces a briny, mineral-heavy oyster. A low salinity river estuary produces something sweeter, creamier, milder. This means 2 oysters of the exact same species, Crassostrea virginica, grown 5 miles apart in different water conditions, taste completely different. And because they taste different, they can be branded differently. And because they are branded differently, one sells for 60 cents wholesale and the other sells for $3.50 direct to a consumer who found it on Instagram. That is not a farming advantage. That is a marketing advantage. And it is the single biggest predictor of whether an oyster farm makes money or just barely survives. Now, let's talk about who actually gets paid in this chain. You grow the oyster for close to 2 years. You pull it out of the water, sort it, grade it, pack it on ice, and hand it to a distributor. That distributor marks it up 30 to 50%, sells it to a restaurant. The restaurant puts it on a half-shell plate and charges the customer $4 to $6 per oyster. The farmer's cut of that $4 oyster at the raw bar? Somewhere between 50 cents and $1.20. That is 15 to 25% of the final retail price. The distributor takes a cut for logistics. The restaurant takes a cut for ambiance and service. Everyone else in the chain gets paid for moving your product from point A to point B. You get paid for 2 years of work and all the biological risk. This is the ecosystem math. The hatchery that sold you the seed gets paid whether your oysters live or die. The company that leases you the cages gets paid whether you harvest or not. The fuel dock, the ice supplier, the cold storage facility, they all get paid on schedule. The only person in this chain who does not get paid unless everything works is you. So where is the actual money? The real profit in oyster farming does not come from growing a better oyster. It comes from 3 things that have nothing to do with biology. The first is the lease itself. Remember that 2 to 5 year permitting process? That is not just a barrier to entry, it is a moat. Once you have an approved water lease in a good location, you own something that is almost impossible for a competitor to replicate. Your lease is your real asset. Some farmers have sold their operations at multiples that make 0 sense based on revenue, but perfect sense based on the value of the permitted water access. And that value only goes up as coastal regulators make it harder and harder for new applicants to get approved. Every year your lease exists and someone else's doesn't is another year your competitive position strengthens without you doing a thing. The second is brand direct sales. So why doesn't every farmer just sell direct and pocket 4 or 5 times the margin? Because going DTC means you are no longer just a farmer. You need a HACCP certified packing facility, basically a food safety approved processing room, plus a shipping operation, insulated boxes, cold packs, a website, and a customer base that trusts your name enough to order raw shellfish sight unseen off the internet. That is a marketing company that also farms, not a farm that also markets. But for the ones who pull it off, the margin difference is 4, sometimes 5 times wholesale. That isn't an incremental improvement. That is a different business model. The third is the ancillary income most people do not even know exists. Shell recycling. Hatcheries will buy back your spent shells at 50 cents to $1 per bushel because they need them as substrate for new larvae to attach to. Ecosystem restoration grants. Several states now pay farmers per acre for the water filtration services their oysters provide. And agritourism. Farm tours, shucking lessons, private oyster tastings on your dock. In some operations, the tourism side generates more net profit than the oysters themselves. Think about that for a second. The most profitable oyster farmers in America in 2026 are not the best growers. They are the best marketers who happen to grow oysters. Now, the risks. Beyond the normal mortality and Vibrio closures, there are threats that can rewrite the entire business overnight. In 2007 and 2008, oyster hatcheries across the Pacific Northwest experienced a catastrophic die-off. Larvae were dying at rates of 70 to 80%. At first, nobody knew why. Turned out, ocean acidification, the gradual absorption of atmospheric CO2 into seawater, had lowered the pH enough that baby oysters could not form shells in their first 48 hours of life. The water was literally dissolving them before they could grow. These hatcheries supplied the majority of seed for the entire West Coast industry. The collapse threatened to shut down a $100 million sector. They adapted. Monitoring systems, water buffering with soda ash, timing hatchery intake around upwelling cycles, which is when deep, cold, carbon-heavy water gets pushed to the surface by coastal winds. But that adaptation cost millions, and it only works as long as someone is watching the chemistry every single day. The underlying problem, rising ocean CO2, hasn't gone away. It is getting worse. And then there is the political risk. In 2014, the Drakes Bay Oyster Company in Point Reyes, California, was forced to shut down permanently. Not because of disease, not because of bankruptcy. The federal government refused to renew their 40-year water lease because the National Park Service wanted to restore the area to wilderness. The Lunny family had bought the operation in 2004, invested years building it into a recognized brand supplying restaurants across the Bay Area, employed about 30 workers. They fought the closure all the way to the Supreme Court. They lost. In December 2014, the farm closed. 30 jobs, a local supply chain, and a brand that took a decade to build, gone. Not because they failed at farming, because someone in Washington decided that particular piece of water had a different highest use. That is the fragility of this business. You do not own the water. You lease it, and a lease can be taken away. So who survives? The farms that are still profitable in 2026 share a few traits. They diversified their sales channels early, so no single restaurant or distributor accounts for more than 20% of revenue. They invested in brand before they needed the cash flow. And most importantly, they picked their water carefully. The farmers who spent an extra year scouting locations, testing salinity profiles, checking historical closure records, those are the ones who did not get wiped out by a problem they could have seen coming. In this business, the decisions that matter most are the ones you make before you ever put a cage in the water. So, after all of that, what does an owner actually make? A small operation, 1 to 3 acres, owner-operated, selling mostly wholesale, you are looking at 30 to 60 grand a year in net income, some years less. A mid-size farm with strong brand positioning and a DTC channel, 80 to 150 grand. A scaled operation with multiple lease sites, a recognized brand, and restaurant relationships across several cities, 200 grand and up. But those numbers hide the real gap. Let me run 2 versions of the same farm. Start with the optimistic case. A 5-acre operation in southern New England. Good Merroir, strong brand, 70% of sales through DTC and direct restaurant accounts. Normal mortality year, maybe 20%. Full harvest, no closures. That farmer clears around 140 to 180 grand net. Now, the realistic case. Same farm, same farmer. But this year, a Vibrio closure hits in July and shuts them down for 3 weeks during peak season. Mortality runs a little high, 35% instead of 20%. They lose one major restaurant account because that restaurant changed chefs and the new guy has a different supplier. Net income drops to 35 to 55 grand. Same farm, same operator, same water. The difference between those 2 years is not effort. It is not skill. It is mostly decisions made before the farm even existed. Which water did you lease? How long did you spend building a brand before you needed the revenue? Did you build a DTC channel, or did you default to wholesale because it was easier in year 1? An oyster farm is not a farm. You are not growing a product. You are growing a permission to harvest from a specific coordinate on the coastline that took someone years to secure. The oyster itself is a commodity. What is not a commodity is the address it grew in, the name you put on the box, and the story you tell the person holding the shell. The real product was never the oyster. It was the water.